And so, what this year holds, I don't know. I think there is a lot underway right now, especially post election in the United States, post inauguration several days ago, and with so many different moving parts to this evolving puzzle regarding the true picture of who is in our world, why they're in our world, what they are doing and historically have done, and what we have done with them in the form of government participation, collaboration, or simply the recovery of exotic technologies and the reverse engineering of these. It is increasingly becoming acknowledged by credible authorities that there is some form of technological arms race underway for these exotic technologies. And I think, we can do by kind of measurement of the negative of the photographic positive that we can't see, that if there is a photographic negative in the sense of an ET or non-human tech arms race, then the positive picture might have certain variables that we must, in fact, explore together. And that is regarding the non-human intelligence themselves, their activity, their intent, their involvements in the world, and what possible agendas might be at play. Because I think it's a low probability that NHI simply accidentally deposited these technologies or allowed their craft to fall from the sky and be recovered by us, and that there is a solid air gap between them and their intent and human governments, defense industries, competing intelligence communities, and their intent. There might be a point of contact. And of course, as you know, if you're a viewer of this show, uh, Emergent is very much about exploring that possible point of contact. I thought it might be kind of interesting to revisit the definition of emergent. I sat long and hard on the question of what to name this show, and I'll give you these three definitions that stood out to me. Emergent phenomena refers to situations where we know the fundamental laws at work, but we cannot predict the consequences because there are so many parts working together. So some of the fundamental factors have been assessed, but how they're interacting is a true unknown and is an emergent phenomenon. Another definition, starting to exist or becoming known. I think our knowledge and understanding of UAP and NHI is truly just starting to come into existence. And then last, an emergent property of a complex system, one that does not belong to any part of that system, but that happens as a result of the parts of the system interacting. Now, a big focus on this show for me is exploring what are some of the outcomes, not of just NHI, their intent, or human actors and their intent, but the convergence of intents, the unpredictable externalities that might arise as a result of the unpredictable and largely unknown nature of historically what has taken place between those two different actors, and what might take place as the public comes into some greater awareness of the phenomenon and its history and its true scope in our world. So once the public climbs in, it truly becomes an emergent reality. So thank you for being on this journey with me. This is episode 8 of the show. I launched it last October out of a sense of personal calling to offer a logical, grounded, methodical assessment of the phenomenon and how it is interacting with the human family and how the human family is interacting with it. So with that, onward. And also, I might add, just please do consider liking and subscribing to the show. Share the show to others. And I would love to get more people in on this conversation week by week. I think it's going to be really important. All right. Today, I'd like to share with you the topics we're going to be covering with our two guests. We're going to be talking about the state of UAP disclosure advocacy, the path forward for disclosure under the Trump administration, notable obstacles and opportunities in taking that forward. And then we're going to look at the evolving conversation as the analysis of this phenomenon begins to shift from craft to controller, from UAP to NHI. And then if we have time, we'll be assessing the X factor, the intent of NHI itself. Please do ask your questions of our two guests tonight or of myself. You can use this QR code with your iPhone or smart device. Scan that, get your questions in the queue, and upvote and downvote each other's questions. So with that, let me introduce and welcome on the show Lester Nare. Lester is the Director of Operations of the UAP Disclosure Fund, an advocacy and policy organization that is at the forefront of engaging with Congress, the executive branch, on the issue of UAP. He is a tech founder and also the creator of UAP Caucus. And he is a prodigious contributor on the topic of UAP, the efforts to advocate for federal transparency and engagement with Congress on this issue. And I have benefited personally from his incisive analysis and his wit, which you can see daily on X. So I do recommend following him there. Welcome, Lester.
Thanks so much, Reed. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Great to have you. And also with us is Kevin Wright. Kevin has 25 plus years of experience in Washington, D.C., in public relations, communications, and issue advocacy. He founded Solve Advocacy, an issue advocacy and communications consulting firm dedicated to UAP and edge science issues. He currently advises the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, the board of directors on public relations, and is a consultant to the New Paradigm Institute and a weekly columnist on the Roswell Daily Record. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Reed. Nice to see you again. And hi, Lester. How are you?
How's it going?
And this is great to host this conversation. We know about each other. We've been looking at each other's work over many months. So great to circle up and have this conversation about what is the path forward for the efforts to advocate for transparency inside the United States government and its executive and legislative branches, and especially in light of a new administration taking office, what are the key steps that might need to be taken, either by advocates for UAP transparency or by the administration itself? So that's our topic for the day. We have a lot to cover. I thought Lester and Kevin, please just share with us a little bit about how you became involved in the field of UAP and disclosure. And if you could, what's a single moment in your journey that solidified your commitment to being involved in this field? Lester, we can start with you.
Yeah, no, so I think I'll just sort of hit a couple of things. So, I'm a Zimbabwean American. I was a child of Zimbabwean immigrants. And for those who know the topic, the Ariel school case is one of the most famous mass sightings to happen in this subject. So there's a little bit of that cultural connection to the issue. There are probably three sort of preceding things that made me get to where I am today. Growing up, my dad and I would fly model rockets and model planes. So that kind of got me into aviation in a general sense. I personally had a very mundane sighting in my early 20s, an orb sighting. It could have been prosaic, but it was sufficiently anomalous to pique my curiosity. But much like many people, it happens and you kind of just don't know what to do with it. You don't have the tools to process, and you kind of put it in the back of your mind. And then the third thing that really kind of got me over the hump was the WikiLeaks emails between, Tom DeLonge and Podesta and a few others that were talking about this concept of disclosure, which at that point, having been someone who was very online throughout my teens, you've seen the stories. The core story was already sort of in my mind, but I didn't have an anchor that made it sort of jump off from being something I saw on the internet to something that was actually a real world thing. And having been a Politico or just someone who was a policy wonk for a long time, that was a space where I felt like, oh, this is an arena that I can engage this subject in. The thing I think that made me go public was post 2017 and watching the lack of media coverage and the lack of just like analysis, frankly, that you would normally see around any other subject was a little bit frustrating. And then once Grush came forward, I was like, we need to have more people just having conversations like we're having here. And at that point, I'd done enough of the work around researching to feel like I could comfortably step in and at least try to provide some of the work that needs to be done, because there's certainly plenty of work to do in and around this subject.
Great, Lester. Great to get that sense of your journey. Kevin, tell us about you.
Well, I mean, like you said, I've been here in Washington, D.C. for 25 years or so and working in politics. And, the UAP issue isn't something that I gave a lot of consideration to. Obviously, growing up, I watched X-Files and sci-fi movies and had a lot of interest. But it wasn't anything that I gave a whole lot of thought to in terms of, the reality of it or something. I probably always believed that there was extraterrestrial life or something. But I probably come to this topic in a little more unusual way, in the sense that in 2018 my father died, and it made me think more about what happens to you after you die, and sort of thing. If something happens, if you're just a body and you're done, or if there's something more that continues on. And so I started reading a lot about afterlife studies and that sort of thing. And the more I read about it, the more interested I became in it, the more that I would read or listen to podcasts and find that there was possibly a connection to, of all things, UAP or UFOs. So I started delving, deeper and deeper into both of these sort of rabbit holes. And it became obvious to me that the most effective way to sort of get to the truth of these matters would be to, get involved, in a serious way, in a professional way, and use some of my expertise that I've developed over the last, 20 plus years in working in politics and advocacy and communications, and find ways to be able to communicate to the public, about these issues that they are largely, not aware of and haven't been educated on. And that includes also the press and now members of Congress. And so I started getting more and more involved, and now we here are today having discussion about how we're going to move disclosure forward or affirmation forward.
Yeah, great stuff, guys, and glad to be in the fight with you all. And I resonate with that sense of a personal calling. Is how I would describe it. Episode 1 of the show is called the UFO calling. But just to use whatever skills you have and bring them to the table in what is an underskilled, understaffed, undermanned, and womaned effort. So appreciate you both for that and all your work on this. So thank you. And also Lester, yeah, post Grush, I think 2023 was a huge year, huge for this issue. And when Grush came forward at the congressional hearings, the summer of that year, and then followed by the Seoul conference, that maybe November, December, that was game on for me. That this is a different situation than I'd been used to for decades with the UFO issue, because I had been involved and aware much of my life. But this was next next level. Curious, like, what's the feel for you guys in terms of the current, both the state of disclosure, what's coming forward, who's coming forward, the nature of the conversation? How does it feel to you?
I'll just sort of maybe briefly say, I think there are more variables at play now, and that creates opportunity, right? It's always going to be a tough nut to crack, because especially in the West, I think our foundations and how we think about the world, and how we create our worldview culturally, makes it a hard entry point to really start to try to break down this subject. But when we look just strictly at the sort of political environment, we've never seen this many high-level officials coming forward, in any capacity, effectively saying there's something going on, and I would like to know the answer to that question, right? And I think that substrate is it can be overlooked because people are like, well, we've known about this for so long. That's true, but we've never been in an environment where you have a bipartisan, and also across the executive and legislative branch, just a real desire to start asking the questions, which again, we have been in bits and pieces over the last several decades, but in terms of a consistent momentum building and expanding cohort of people in positions that can actually effectuate change, we are in a one-of-one environment that has never been seen before. And that seems to me to be exciting, despite, I think, folks who might feel like things are moving slowly. I understand that. But any social political movement, think civil rights movement, takes a significant amount of time and effort in order to shift the Overton window and change the paradigm. But I do think it's we have not been in a situation like we are currently before, particularly when you add into it that there's a now quote unquote maverick president who maybe operates outside of the norms that we've seen historically, where that again creates just a potential opening for things to be different. Not that they will be, but the variables are fundamentally different.
Yeah, I would agree with that so much. Kevin, and you've been in DC for so long. You've got that insider's look. How is it looking these days? I'm sure everyone would want to know that.
Well, I agree with everything that Lester said. And I always sort of look at life as the glass is half full. And I've recognized that there is momentum, that there is, the last several years, there's been, more and more stories. There've been more people coming forward. There have been numerous people that have given testimony to, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So there's certainly lots of things going on. But at the same time, I like to try to make sure that I keep myself grounded and realize that there is, significant hurdles ahead. For example, if you listen to what Jake Barber was telling Ross Coulthart in terms of, giving testimony to members of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, that there are people that are literally afraid inside of Congress of touching this with a 10-foot pole.
Mhm.
They're scared, not just for their reputations, not just because of the seats they hold and afraid of losing election, but they're scared for their safety and well-being, because this is a serious issue and people have been threatened. And if you listen to David Grush and Jake Barber and others, there are serious allegations that have reportedly been run up the chain of commands to ICs and the Department of Justice that people have been murdered in the process of this cover-up. So there are serious obstacles still ahead that we can't be have our blinders onto. That you also take into consideration the fact that I've briefed like about 50 offices last year on Capitol Hill about UAP, and the vast majority have just absolutely no idea what I'm talking about when I first walk in. But after 30 minutes, they're like deer caught in headlights. They are blown away by, the evidence of the fact this isn't just a modern phenomenon that the Department of Defense started to look into for the last 20 years. It dates back to at least the 1940s. That the things that people are witnessing now, even, some of the instances in some of the drone incursions that we've seen, to the Tic Tac, to other instances, especially over nuclear facilities and military installations, that we had these same sorts of occurrences back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So, this is a very real thing that's been going on, and they've been very good at covering it up for 80 years, and they're going to do their best to make sure that that cover-up continues. So while at the same time we have momentum and there's reason for optimism, we have to make sure that we are paying attention to the fact that the gatekeepers and people involved in the program, whatever you want to call it, are very good at what they do. And they've been very successful for 80 years. And they're going to do whatever they can to make sure that continues.
Yeah, that's the sobering reality right there. I'm curious, late last year we had a number of precipitating events. We had the mystery drone anomalous vehicle um, issue starting in the UK over US air bases and nuclear armed facilities there, and then moving over to New Jersey, and then reappearing in Europe, Ramstein Air Force Base, Germany, and then spreading out over other parts of the US. We had that. We had the congressional hearings with 4 whistleblower testimonies being provided sometime in November, I believe, right after the election. And then we had the election, right? And President-elect Trump has gone on various platforms to talk about, in no uncertain terms, that he's been told about UAP, he's been told there's something there, and that he would disclose. And he's also gone further to make some pretty large statements regarding what might be behind the phenomenon. So how are you both seeing these converge in the last 3 months? I mean, is there a burst of interest? Is there a burst of the suppression of interest? What's the kind of bead on the beltway and the inner reality in terms of the government and how they're responding?
I don't know if you want to go. Feel free, Kevin.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, in my personal opinion, I don't think that the drone incursions over, the military installations in the UK, over places in New Jersey and other parts of the United States, it wasn't just New Jersey, it was other places too, Australia and other countries that were reporting similar episodes of anomalous objects in the sky. I'm not sure that it has anything to do with the election or Donald Trump. So that would be sort of a separate sort of bucket. And then, Trump, obviously, he's unpredictable. He's a bit of a wild card. But that's potentially why, he is somebody that's sort of perfect for the time, potentially, to do something that is unpredictable and unexpected, which would be to stand up to the people that have kept the secret for so long and reveal something that that they don't want revealed. And that speaks to the heart of what he calls the so-called deep state. And if there is such a thing, that is the deep state. It is the people that have obscured and obfuscated, engaged in disinformation campaigns to hide the reality of a non-human intelligence, objects in the skies that are made by a non-human intelligence, what the implications of those things are, the possible technologies involved, potential for clean energy, all sorts of things. So Donald Trump, just might be the person to finally crack the nut on this.
Mhm. Are you
I do.
hearing members of Congress stirring with new interest, or how are they responding to these various events?
A little bit. I was at the Black Tie and Boots Ball on Sunday evening, put on by the Texas Society, and I ran into a couple of staffers that I had previously briefed, and they recognized me, and they said, "Hey, we'd like to have another briefing with you sometime soon. With all the stuff going on with the drones, last fall, and some other developments, we'd like to have further conversations, sometime soon. So hopefully in the next week or two, we'll have those conversations."
Oh, great.
I do think it's President Trump is obviously a divisive character, and so people usually fall on one or other extreme sides of this, which is like, obviously he's going to be the disclosure president, and he's only ever going to do something for his own personal benefit. And I actually don't know that those things are mutually exclusive. They're always framed as being mutually exclusive, but I don't know that that's the case. I think there's several arguments one could make for why there'd be a personal incentive for Trump to disclose, for any number of reasons. I also think there's an element here that's interesting that sometimes gets overlooked, which is when we look at like the corporate entities around this subject, right? You have the sort of old defense primes that have been alleged to be the ones so closely tied with sort of the reverse engineering pieces of this sort of issue. And there's been a interesting movement within sort of the tech way, the San Francisco sort of Silicon Valley community, who have as much money as the DC blob, the old defense primes, these other big power centers, and they have kind of been left out in the cold on this issue. And not everybody in that cohort is like happy about that. So I think as you see, when you look at the orbit around Trump, the way I've always described it, there's sort of like four groups. You have obviously the new tech billionaires who currently seem to be sitting in pole position around him. This is the Elons, the Vivek's, JD Vance, who was a venture capitalist for quite some time, his vice president, who's also made public comments around this. That's one group. You sort of have the Project 2025 wing of the Republican Party. So these are people where deportation, immigration issues, that's kind of their main policy focus. You kind of have the evangelicals, or the religious wing, where things like the LGBTQ issue and abortion are kind of prominent things for them. And then you have like the sort of the old school classic Republicans, some might say like the neocon wing, the ones that want to do these wars everywhere. So part of what you have to say is, okay, how are those four groups going to sit at the same table when they have priorities that are somewhat you can only do so much in an administration. So you have to figure out what issues to prioritize. And it seems to be the case that of those four cohorts, that San Francisco new tech billionaire wing is most predisposed to being pro-disclosure, because that gives them an opportunity to get to the goodies that they've been left out in the cold on.
Right.
At the same time, the evangelicals, who or the religious wing, where there's going to be a large contingent of that are going to view this as demons or demonology. They're not just necessarily going to sit down and allow that to happen. Also, with this idea that there's a limited window to sort of push through policy objectives, where some of these other cohorts have been waiting in line for 25, 30 years to get a chance to have, the Senate, the House, and a maverick president who's willing to push things forward. So there is going to be a real battle of priority, because if you move on quote unquote disclosure, it's going to take up a lot of oxygen in the room, just by the nature of the subject. And so there, I think, yes, there's an opportunity with a Trump presidency. There are conventional political dynamics around what's going to get oxygen that are complicated, let alone that no president previously has touched this issue. So I think I'm just sort of dovetailing back to Kevin's point earlier. Like, I always am optimistic that, as long as we do the work, the arc is going to get us to the end goal. But when we look strictly at the current administration, there are serious challenges that we have to work around based on some of those dynamics.
Yeah, if I could just reiterate one of the points that Lester was making here about the Silicon Valley, the tech industry, these sort of things, they have been left out of, or at least allegedly left out of, these programs, if they exist, in crash retrieval, reverse engineering programs, figuring out what's going on here with, how these craft operate. There's something to take into consideration about their interest in pushing this forward for disclosure for themselves, which is that whether you're talking about crypto or AI, or any number of other technology issues today, the fact of the matter is that with the expansion of AI and the expansion of crypto, we're talking about needing about 10 times as much energy production in this country than we have now. That includes 10 times more than what we have in terms of the energy infrastructure grid that we have now. And so we're going to need something more than just the wind and solar and clean energy solutions that we have. And we obviously can't just go back and start building more coal burning factories and these sorts of things. So there's a great potential that these technologies represent some sort of clean energy, or 0 point energy, or something along those lines. So I think there's a great hope that there's something in there that allows us to build the infrastructure and the capabilities, because we absolutely need them. Because, like I said, we're going to need 10 times as much electricity in this country in 10 years than we have today. So that's definitely a very compelling reason for disclosure and get this technology into the hands of private industry.
I want to just quickly say that nexus is so important, and I'm glad you brought that up, Kevin, because it doesn't get talked about a lot. Where the energy requirements to be the leader in AI and the leader in crypto, which I think are both important fundamental technologies for us as a nation generally to lead on, there's not a clear through line to how we're going to do so. And I think that incentive makes some of the positioning that you're seeing by some of these entities make a lot of sense. And if you look at even just this week, they announced Project Stargate, this $500 billion, program around building AI infrastructure, a key component of which is power. You can't have the conversation about artificial general intelligence and scaling up compute and all this without us significantly scaling up our power infrastructure. I just think that's such a really great thing to point to, Kevin, about the nexus of power and the potential for these UAP technologies to enable these other emergent technologies.
That's right. And it's also, a great geopolitical, component to this in terms of the United States positioning against China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, especially China, in particular as a peer competitor in the global sphere of competition and potentially future warfare. And that, this is a race that we have to win with AI in particular against China, because they're racing against us as well. We have to take it seriously. So,
yeah, I hear here kind of another nexus, one of incentives and the other of risk. You have to incentivize doing this. This is a hard task for a federal government that doesn't reveal secrets. That's not what governments do, right? They retain information, they gain technological ability or military capability above their competitors, and they compete and they win. And so we're asking for a good faith disclosure, hopefully an honest one, and complete enough to be accurate, because partial disclosure could in effect be inaccurate or incorrect disclosure. We're acting for this good faith gesture to be undertaken by an administration which has all these other priorities. At the Seoul conference, I heard this this nexus was on display all the time. Carl Nell talked about this is the special relativity to general relativity of ethical implications regarding these technologies, right? Who gets them? Who gets to market them? Who gets to patent them? Which university writes the cornerstone paper? Who gets rich and famous, and seals up their career legacy, their financial power over their competitors? I mean, it's enormous. And then when you take it internationally, even if we do this ethically inside the bounds of this country, we could end up in a true physical kinetic global war over technologies like this with other countries and superpowers. I mean, we're already set up for that. So, I get the need to incentivize and to wake people up to the possibility that, hey, there could be something in this that either gives us the technology to fix our climate crisis, or that heals racial, religious, political divides, unites us. But the implications ethically and for deleterious outcomes are pretty significant in a world that's built on competition, and is already has how many dozens of hot conflicts underway that could be inflamed by something as extravagant and as powerful as non-human exotechnologies.
Real
So,
easy stuff to deal with, right?
right, right. Well, that's why the smart people are being called to the front. And if you're watching and you're feeling that, like, I got to get in, well, you do, you do got to get in. Um, I'd like to turn attention to one thing, which is news of the day, and I'm sure everyone's got their head on it, and that is this imminent declassification of records concerning the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This was put out, I believe, yesterday. And it was put out by the administration with very aggressive timelines. We see 15 days here. Somewhere else, we see 30 days. The administration wants an assessment of these records and a plan to release them. And, for those who are aware of the history of ufology, there is a presumed or speculated upon connection between the assassination of JFK and the UFO issue. I wanted to get both your take on this. Does this feel like possibly, the first stone on the land that triggers a landslide, or are we looking at potentially something done to satisfy short-term, um, you know, election promises that were made and to satisfy the base or whoever's watching, but it's not necessarily going to contain anything UFO related? What's your sense of this one?
Go ahead, Lester.
Um, so it's for sure. I mean, I think again, both things could be true. I think part of this whole discussion is there's a duality to all of this, right? So clearly it's red meat for the base, right? Just from a purely political lens. There's the juxtaposition that the administration is trying to put forth is that we can get SHIT done, right? And we can do it quickly, and we're responding to the demands of the public. And it again dovetails with this: we're not the deep state. We're exposing the secrets the deep state didn't want to bring forward. The JFK UFO connection is obviously a strong part of the lore of the subject. I don't necessarily know that the move was taken as a planned prerequisite to like some new executive orders coming out or further declassification coming from the White House. But I do think that there's potential for there to be some kind of breadcrumb within those documents that do get that sort of start to bolster, right, with direct chain of custody, that there is this long-term issue related to this that did rise to the level of the presidency. And there seems to be, from folks we know that have testified publicly on this issue in front of Congress, they believe there to be the connection that does exist in documents. The question just becomes, have those been deconflicted by those in control of the information to kind of squirrel it away into some other national security bucket in order to avoid that exposure? So that's maybe my just. It'll be interesting to see with those aggressive timelines if that actually does hit the National Archives. But regardless of the UAP subject specifically, I think general declassification is important, and this is something that should be done anyway, right? And if there's that added benefit of the UFO connection, I think it's, again, that will get very interesting very quickly if that does exist there.
Right. What do you
Yeah.
think, Joe?
So, it's a minefield of speculation, but looking, what was his name? I think his name is Jeff Cruikshank. I think his name is Australian investigative reporter that's done a lot of work in this subject between JFK's assassination and the UFO connection. He did a like an hour-long thing on News Nation with Ross Coulthart, Reality Check. It was fascinating, made a very compelling case that there's a very solid connection there between JFK, his assassination, and UFOs. There seems to be, a great chance that there's something connected there. What I would find most interesting is if really the reason why we've had so much secrecy and all these documents have been withheld is because there's one piece of paper in there that actually proves that to be the case, because then that unravels this other even bigger secret. That would really just be sort of the mind-blowing event, is that there's this document or something here that proves that the UFO thing is real and the government knows about it. It's been covering it up, and that JFK was assassinated because of it. I mean, that would really be just mind-blowing. So I don't know whether that's the case. Like I said, Jeff made an extremely compelling case for that being the case, but then again, there's been compelling cases for the mafia, for the CIA, for any number of things, inside jobs, all kinds of stuff. So I don't have enough information and knowledge to say one way or another. I just think it's a fascinating thing to discuss, and we'll see. And Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State under the Trump's first administration, addressed this with, I think it was Jesse Waters of Fox News, talking about what's still remaining in the 4,000 something documents that are inside the archive that haven't been released. And he said, there's nothing really there. But then he transitioned to, I've also seen the UFO files. But then, at the end of that interview, he also admitted that he had actually not seen every single document that was still not released yet. So, we'll see, if all these documents actually do come out and they're not redacted, and all the people that have investigated this for decades will be able to quickly analyze, what's in there and make some determinations if there's something actually relevant, and we'll see soon enough, hopefully.
Yeah,
I just
yeah. I
want to
was
quickly
just looking at Geoff Cruikshank's post the day that this came out, because right after the White House posted this announcement, Chuck Schumer posted, "Now do UFOs,"
That's right.
to which Geoff said, "I think he just did. JFK was assassinated because he was about to reveal the alien presence. Two birds with one stone." So
Well,
take it
he
as you
also
will.
posted to a document from WikiLeaks that I don't know the accuracy of whether or not it's real or not, but it's a very compelling document too.
I just want to make two quick notes. One is, when Pompeo touched on this, the way he couched it was, we have bigger problems, right, to deal with than that, this stuff. I think the one aspect to think about is he really well versed in the history to really understand the implications of minutia that might be in those documents that researchers would understand the import of, but he might not. So that's one way to kind of think about it. The other thing I think that's interesting about this is an X factor here is the declassification of the JFK files might create some potential freedom of movement for Harold Malmgren, who was the presidential advisor to several presidents, who has become much more out in the open in the last, let's say, 6-8 months about his personal experience at the level of the office of the president over multiple administrations around this subject. And he may feel more inclined to speak more candidly with basically President Trump saying that it's time to talk about all the aspects of the JFK assassination. So if there is a nexus, I'd be curious to see Harold Malmgren's statements, if any, in the wake of that disclosure.
That's a great point. And I don't know if everybody noticed it or not, but a month or two ago, Senator Mike Brown from South Dakota, who was one of the co-sponsors in 2023 and then the prime sponsor in 2024 of the UAP Disclosure Act, had a public admission that he had recently met with Harold Malmberg, which is an interesting development. So, read between the lines of what was going on there. But things are afoot.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff, guys. Great. Well, to dive a little bit deeper in, let's talk about, post inauguration, new administration. I believe there's a new session of Congress um, presently. So, as two guys who are on the front lines of advocating for government transparency on UAP, what's the path forward as you see it? What would you advocate for among those you're in touch with in the government, or among other advocates as well?
I mean, where do you start, right? There's
And
still
we can go line by line. We could start with the UAP Disclosure Act as well, because I would like to touch on that.
so I think there's a lot of doors right now, and like Kevin was mentioning earlier, that there are centers of gravity within Congress right now that are interested in this, but it's not pervasive across all members, right? It's Congress is quite large. I think if you bifurcate this into two lanes, you have the legislative paths and then you have the executive paths. The obvious on the executive side, like the obvious path is using executive orders to do any number of things. Institute whistleblower protections specifically for programs that are classified under executive authority. You could also create you know, a, a role for a UAP czar, which is, the policy brief that Lou Elizondo recently put out. Also, the repatriation of control around this is another issue. So, I mean, there's executive action that can be done as one path, and then you know within Congress, I mean, the number one thing that would be the most valuable is a select committee, ideally with a special prosecutor that really starts going aggressively after this issue. But Speaker Mike Johnson has already sort of decided not to initiate that select committee at the beginning of the 119th Congress. So as of right now, that seems to be a dormant thing until there's an inciting incident that just justifies the creation. But the other big thing would be, again, whistleblower protections. I know we keep sort of beating this drum, but if you've seen sort of the recent testimonies from the likes of, Jake Barber and, Fred Baker and all these sort of tier one guys that are coming forward, and also the way that they describe Congress's fear around this issue, the threat is real. And so there's not only the physical security issue, there's also the livelihood issue. And so that's just on like the direct, getting to the program stuff. But there's also sort of ancillary things like Safe Airspace for Americans, which could be reintroduced as a bill to help commercial pilots feel more comfortable reporting, which would again just create an environment that continues to destigmatize. So there's stuff that's like more direct to the program. There's stuff that's more ancillary or maybe tangential, but would be helpful around creating a more healthy environment for conversation. I mean, there's a million things we could dive into, but those are just some high level touch points, which is separate and apart from just having more hearings within either the oversight or intel committees, which there's some complexities there based on some of the new folks that have joined those.
I do want to ask about that too, because I know those committees got mixed up in terms of, or remixed in terms of their leadership. So Mike Turner out and other notable events. Kevin, you penned this article recently. I read it earlier today, and it was great. And I noted the significant hurdles for this formation of a select committee. I'm in no way an expert on anything related to legislation or policymaking in this way, but give us kind of the short and skinny on what is it that needs to happen, and can it happen, or are the obstacles too many?
Well, I don't think the obstacles are too many. I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. But I mean, the sort of the short of it is that for Congress, either in the Senate or in the House, to set up a select committee requires, the vote of the House or the Senate to establish such a thing. So a member or the Speaker of the House or the majority leader would need to put forward a resolution that would establish the select committee, and if that would outline the various powers, scope of the investigation, et cetera, that would be required for it to do. And so, say a member like a Tim Burchett says to Speaker Johnson, I'm going to put forward a resolution requesting a select committee to investigate the executive branch and its activity and knowledge of UAP issues. And then, Speaker Johnson has to essentially agree to put that resolution on the House floor. And then, of course, you have to have a majority vote that passes that. So, I mean, that in and itself is a pretty big hurdle, because you have to convince the majority leader, or I'm sorry, the House Speaker, that that this is a worthwhile endeavor, that you're going to put his reputation on the line, and that they're going to have a majority that supports his position. I don't think that is where we're at exactly in the House or the Senate today, with enough members going to go out on a limb and support such a committee to do such an investigation, because most members of Congress are just honestly oblivious to the reality of UAP. In that article, I highlight some of the people who have been at least somewhat involved on the UAP issue, but not recalling who David Grush was, or not recalling or serving on the Armed Services Committee, and not really knowing what the UAP Disclosure Act was. So, I mean, these are people that should know much more about the issue than the average congressman. So if you extrapolate that to everybody else, you're going to realize that the vast majority of members of Congress have absolutely no idea what we're talking about right now on UAP. So one of the things that needs to take place, and Lester and I have worked together, physically we've been in offices together, briefing members of Congress and their staffs about the reality of this issue. And what's become very apparent is that over the course of the next year, we're going to have to go to 435 offices on the House side and 100 offices on the Senate side, and get them to understand that this is a real issue. And one of the ways that we need to do that is, if you go to somebody that is on, say, the Veterans Affairs Committee on the House, they usually serve on one or two committees at most, and make the issue, germane to them and their constituents and what their interests are. So if you go to somebody that serves on the Veterans Affairs Committee, you say, look, there are members of the military and intelligence community and employees of the federal government who have sustained injuries because of their close proximity to UAP. You need to provide them with answers and benefits, and death benefits in some instances. You go to somebody on the energy committee, you say, look, there's the potential for this clean energy. The same with somebody that's on the environmental committee, that there's a potential for mitigating climate change. So there's any number of ways of reaching out to these individual members, but you have to make it specific to them, because they're not paying attention to this issue at all, because it's not in their it's not in their face. It's not something that they're paying attention to, because majority of their constituents don't care. So we have to also educate the public about it. So those are some of the significant hurdles that we have in not just generating a select committee, but also generating enough interest and knowledge base on Capitol Hill, and that begins with educating the public.
I want to piggyback on that because I agree across the board, and there's another layer here, which is that there are staffers and members are like two different constituencies, and there's sometimes a different level of understanding with staffers who are like making the sausage versus members. So like one thing is like both cohorts kind of need to be quote unquote read into the contemporary nature of this issue. One of the challenges, and Kevin kind of touched on this, is like the issue is extremely abstract for a lot of people. And so you go to them and you're like, you bring it up and they're like, okay, what do you want me to do about it? And so part of it is finding ways to make it germane, particularly to the jurisdiction of the committees that people are on. I think one thing that we can look at as a reference point is the way in which Havana syndrome, or the anomalous health incidents issue, has been able to emotionally connect. Like that issue has been able to have an emotional connection with members, where if you watched the most recent hearing, it was in the Senate, I can't remember which committee, late last year, you can see the level of engagement from members as there was a panel sort of discussing the issue that veterans were having, just, or folks who used to previously work for the government were having, just getting their benefits. And if there's one thing about Americans that's true, regardless of a lot of political stripes, is people separate the folks who decide to make us go to war with those who serve and protect us. And there is a huge, I think, support for veterans being able to like get what they deserve in terms of having served the country. So the angle that those in and around the anomalous health incidents issue kind of went with was making it a human story about vets, and it allowed there to be some grounding for members to grab onto in terms of, oh, I know what we need to do about this. We need to rectify, the sort of benefits that these folks were not getting, and then that's now begun to unravel the larger implications of this, so much so that the National Science Foundation had to rescind previous data from a study around this because they found out that the CIA was basically fuzzing the data. And the
Mm.
Biden administration had to issue a statement right, before the transition saying that they were going to brief the Trump admin on this subject. And I think part of that comes from, again, in the world of politics, we have to find the grounding element for folks because it is such a sprawling issue with so many tentacles and implications.
Mhm.
The question becomes, where do we start? And helping kind of give people like a real world connection point to the subject.
And
Absolutely.
walk us through, and I'm sure the viewers would be fascinated to know, like, what does it look like to sit down with a staffer or a congressman or woman to, quote, "brief them on this?" And what is the exigency? What is the necessity that comes along with the UAP issue in your minds or your experience that has led to, like, that emotional connection or that sense of urgency?
So I'll share two things. So one is depending on where you go, right? Some folks are much more well versed in this than others. So it's interesting. You can immediately tell as soon as you sit down. Some folks really like they know, and you can tell that they're sort of just trying to see what you have to say about it, and they're trying to get
Mhm.
a gauge of like, oh, this is someone from the public that has a real sort of viewpoint on what to do. Because again, they're looking for d- direction to some extent to what to do about it. So it was interesting in some cases, uh, particularly like the national security staffers, in some cases are very well aware of the issue and the implications, but that's not universal. The one of the entry points is the constitutional aspect of this, which is, you can always sort of appeal to people's ego. You have a right to this information and you're not being given it. And that's kind of like an easy place to start because it's like once you then get the information, you will have an understanding of how grave the implications are of what we're talking about. I will just quickly share an interesting story. My experience has always been most staffers are attentive, they listen, they might not have an idea of what the entry point is or what's going on, but they're at least willing to sit down and listen. There was an interesting experience um, prior to the November hearing last year, where it was obviously being chaired by uh, the Republican majority, and we were trying to provide a briefing to the Democratic side, who did not, based on some public statements from a few reps, did not seem super engaged, or because of the way Representative Comer has run the oversight committee, a lot of hearings in that committee have been purely political, you know, political hearings, or some folks would say stunts to basically point the finger at the Biden administration and the deep state and all this other stuff. So there was a view that this was just another exercise in trying to sort of disparage career civil servants and all of this. And what was interesting about this hearing was, sorry, this briefing was, it was with two staffers, and then a third staffer who was not scheduled to be in the meeting joined. And this person was so overtly adversarial around this issue, it almost didn't make sense, because of just it was a pretty neutral. It wasn't like anything crazy. And since having had that experience, we've now found out that this person is uh, is pushing back on this for a reason. I'll just couch it as that. And so I think
Hmm.
part of this is um, the gatekeepers are good, right? And they have people everywhere. And within the professional staffers that are in these committees, they certainly have folks who are there to push back on these efforts. That's only ever happened once, but that was the first time I personally experienced. You guys both have met me. I'm pretty diplomatic and not really someone to get elevated over in a conversation. And so to have someone red in the face kind of accusing me of being a shill for Republicans, which is laughable as a Black Ivy Leaguer who lives in Los Angeles, that was very, very interesting. So I think part of what I'm just trying to share here is there is both a push and pull happening in terms of the information that this audience is getting, right?
Right, right. I mean, the comment, "You can't talk about Fight Club because there's no Fight Club," that was made during the last congressional hearing. I mean, this is part of the anecdotal indications that there is something very big, very secret, and that is willing to engage in hostile acts, whether it's in the form of communication, like right in your face in the office of a congressman, or in other ways. And that says to me that there's a there, very directly.
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Yeah, and the other thing is, if this is advancing in ways that can no longer be controlled effectively and swept under the carpet, toothpaste can't be put back in the tube, the elements that have been keeping the secret, they don't just roll over. In fact, they might even become involved in the disclosure movement. They might even try to, there's the word, co-opt and redirect and deflect. And what's your thoughts on that? I mean, do you see evidence of that these operatives are in the space?
Kevin, feel free to touch that one if you want.
And you can feel free to name names too. I'm sure people would love it.
Well, first, let's go back to what Lester was talking about here with, meeting with offices. And I think, the experience runs a wide gambit of experiences in terms of, you meet some people and they have absolutely no knowledge going into the meeting of what you're really going to be discussing with them, to people that are very well informed and probably know more than I do in terms of what's been reported to various committees of Congress, and are very knowledgeable. And then there's some that don't take it seriously, and at the beginning they kind of have a smirk on their face, but by the time you finish, their doors are blown off. They're rethinking what they previously thought 30 minutes ago, and some of them are going through a bit of an ontological shock because they're realizing that the information and the evidence that you're providing them changes their entire perspective on an issue that they had not given much thought to before. In some instances, I've met with, people who are on fellowship from, various intelligence community, 3-letter agencies and things. And so it's very difficult to know exactly how much they know and how much they're internalizing what you're telling them and what's happening with that information. And, I've met with people who, I walk in and say, "Hey, I'm here to talk about UAP." And, the staffer says, "Oh, I was in the Navy, and actually one of the things I was doing was I was, deployed on a, battleship group because we were there to investigate, some occurrences that were happening." So it really runs in a wide range of, discussions, knowledge level and things. And then also you don't know exactly what some of their motivations might be in having that meeting with you, which goes into your, your new question here, Reed. And, it's a very difficult question to answer because you don't know what people's motivations are. Some people are, very intense, which can be sort of a tell to some extent. But that happens on both sides, the debunkers and skeptics, and then the pro-disclosure, transparency advocates, and you have everything that runs in between. And so I would say that it's definitely happening, and for probably various reasons, and some of which is to shape the narrative of what's happening so that they can influence the discussion and the outcome of what the disclosure ends up looking like.
Right. Yeah.
I do think there's certainly perception management going on around this issue. Even if it's just couched as these are just our advanced strategic capabilities and they have nothing to do with non-human intelligence, but as such, they have such mass strategic importance that you are going to perception manage in order to protect those advanced strategic capabilities. So even in a conventional way of trying to view this, like that's certainly true. Obviously, with the possibility of the NHI origin, that only raises the bar of importance quite a bit. I mean, we can sort of see literally this, I think yesterday or today, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office put out a paper about UAPs being confused for Starlink as, again, I don't even know what to say. I don't even know, there is clearly an effort to, because here's the thing, right? You probably see two camps around folks who are former intelligence people or whatever around how to try to move this forward. One camp is saying, keep the rotten food in the fridge, to use Lou Elizondo's analogy. Let's just start putting up new systems like the Gremlin system that Arrow's come up with, and say that we've just now started seeing this stuff and we don't know what it is. And you sort of start the narrative from now moving forward, and you just don't deal with the past, right? So like that's like one camp. The other camp is like, no, we need to talk about retrievals. We need to talk about the reverse engineering. We need to sort of go as close to full open kimono without, again, touching on our national security strategic asset pieces. So you could probably call that the like Grushnell wing. And then the Mellon wing is maybe more the something's weird. We have to sort of the incrementalist approach. And like, I think part of the challenge for us who are trying to advocate for greater disclosure around this is that there is not agreement, particularly from those closest to the issue, around how we need to move forward. And then that also creates opportunity for the co-opt issue to then, again, sow discord amongst what is, generally the North Star is the same across that sort of spectrum of how we should approach it. It's just a matter of degree of how honest we want to be about the past, which in my view is like the necessary thing in order to sort of be able to really move forward. There has to be some form of truth and reconciliation process here. But I don't know what we don't know what we don't know. So it's a complex issue, but I think because there's sort of this wide spectrum of how we should deal with it, as from an ideological perspective, that creates actually opportunity to sort of divide people across these two sort of lanes.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that Lester was making there between the two camps. But I think, inside the sort of the pro-disclosure transparency camp, that, he's absolutely right that there is disagreement there in terms of sort of how to proceed and how to achieve the end result. But I think the great debate is also what that end result should look like in terms of, like he referenced the past, how much information should actually be revealed. And I'm not just referring to like real national security issues in terms of, potential, weapons platforms or technology that have been developed as a result of crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs. But I'm talking about the criminality and some of the things that have happened over the course of the last 80 years, particularly potentially, people that have been involved that have potentially big names, in this cover up and in furtherance of the cover up. And, and also, some of the things that have been alluded to in Jake Barber's discussion with, Ross Coulthart, he gets into some pretty deep things there, especially if you watch the full 2 hours and 40 minutes of the full, interview that he did that's been released. I think it was today or, late last night. Gets into some pretty deep stuff there that, rings true to a lot of conversations that I've had and things that you read and part of the lore. And those are things that aren't just damaging to certain people and reputations, but would rock the foundation of our republic and our constitution and our government institutions, and really would cause some very serious soul searching on amongst the American populace about the government in which they believed that they lived in, but it's been revealed to them that the country that they've been living in isn't really where they are. That there's some very nefarious things going on for very unclear purposes. So to what level do we go in revealing the truth? I think that's at the heart of it.
Right. Yeah, I've been asking this question for a while now, which is we all want disclosure, but no one likes to talk much about what is this disclosure of? What is the disclosure or the set of disclosures? I mean, if it's something so tremendously difficult and with illegalities involved and criminality or even hostile intent by the visitation itself or their act, I mean, it becomes a different matter and a different pathway toward effective resolution. I just want to turn our eyes to this topic of that's been brought up of a UAP czar or a presidential advisor on UAP. I asked this question to Twitter, and I was kind of surprised by the results. I was not expecting these results, and definite clear story there. And I wonder, what do you see in this? Like, why is there such an uneven distribution here, or an uneven candidacy in the mind of at least 1,000 people? Not to say that that's representative.
Well, I don't think it's entirely uneven. I mean, you have essentially, 3 people as primary candidates in roughly in proximity of 30% range. So, splitting a third of the vote. Some obvious deference to David Rush there, but I think all of them personally would probably make good candidates, and they probably have their different strengths and weaknesses. Elizondo was a senior advisor to ATIP and has experience in the investigation and the understanding of the intelligence apparatus and what's been going on there. And then you have David Grush, who did his own investigation and uncovered things and talked to numerous whistleblowers. And then you have Carl Nell, who clearly knows a thing or two and has zero doubt that what we're dealing with here is a non-human intelligence. So I think any one of those candidates would be fantastic, and they probably all bring their own strengths and weaknesses to the potential position. But I don't have a personal opinion on any particular person, but I definitely want whoever that person is to be a bona fide transparency and disclosure advocate, whoever that may be.
Yeah, I'll kind of tease that out a little bit. If we look at each of them individually, and sort of the point that Kevin brought up about strengths and weaknesses, I think they all have their strengths and weaknesses. One thing we have to think about is who is this administration, right? And then who actually would mesh with the stylistics of the administration. So if we just start at the top of the list, Lou is good on TV, right? And so that sort of gives a +1 for him, just because that's kind of how the man in the chair likes to pick people, is who's good on TV. Does that mean that Lou's going to be great at the managerial nature that is going to come with this role, being someone who's more of a guy in the field? Maybe you could argue that's a weakness for Lou, is he doesn't really have executive experience per se to the same degree that maybe a Grush or a Nell has had in terms of running teams and coming up and navigating the halls of the bureaucracy and all that stuff, right? You have Grush, who is, very detail oriented, would be like a dog on a bone around, the minutia and getting to it, but maybe personality wise wouldn't mesh with the stylistics of a Trump admin. Carl Nell, it probably has the most extensive executive experience, having been deputy CTO at Northrop, I believe, and having run massive programs such as the reorganization of Army's Futures Command and all that. So he potentially has the most sort of polish, quote unquote, to navigate that environment. But folks might not agree with Carl's approach, who is the proponent of this kind of controlled disclosure, slow drip incrementalism. I'll just add one other name here that does not seem to be someone who's going to want to do this, but would be interesting, is Jay Stratton, primarily because of his leadership role in OSAP, in ATIP, and in the UAP task force. Has arguably been, has the highest visibility into sort of some of the mechanics of where this is working and how it's working. Recall like Grush was just, the NGA lead for the UAP task force. Lou just came in on ATIP, and there's sort of conversation about how much Lou did or didn't really know. So Jay is potentially the most well-versed in all of the ways in which this subject operates within the government. But again, I don't think he really has his name in the ring right now for it. But that just kind of parse out, I think, some of the pros and cons of each. That's maybe how you could couch it.
Oh, it's helpful.
I'll
Take
just quickly add here that, I mean, I've never, well, I briefly once quickly met Jay Stratton, but I think, he's a potential person to add to that list because, I'll give a little plug to the new documentary that's coming out in March, The Age of Disclosure. There's a brief clip there where
we're gonna be watching it in about 5 minutes.
I'm sorry?
We're going to be watching it in 5 minutes. The trailer
Oh,
with that brief clip, that 5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll give a little tiny preview here. I mean, he says that he has personally seen NHI craft and beings, and he's investigated the UAP issue for 20 years. So he's definitely somebody that should be considered.
Yeah. Going back to Lester, what you were saying about, these kind of, I don't know if you call them factions or camps, different degrees of disclosure, rate, flow, control, and in different appetite for maybe something more catastrophic or something more all at once than something really, really slow. I think one concern, especially with the new administration, is that people who have been formerly on the program or might have liability, legal implication, past criminal activity, who knows, might try to kind of circle around the administration and snuff this out. And not to say stop it entirely, but really claim the narrative and take it where they want to take it, for a variety of personal ends, self-interest, financial interests, what have you. So, I mean, how do you view that risk at this moment?
What's interesting, and I'm trying to find it right now. The point that you're bringing up is actually something that Lou explicitly called out in his policy brief, which name correctly, prioritizing emerging all domain technologies was the title of the policy brief. But he touched on it where basically his point was whoever gets brought in as this potential czar, when they're staffing up, the point he made is you have to be extremely careful to not bring in folks whose priorities might not be aligned with that of the White House around having an earnest effort towards this disclosure. So I think that risk is obviously extremely high, which is you don't want to let the fox into the hen house. And so that's really, I think that's going to really be a challenge, is because you can't, people from the inside know where the bodies are buried. So like you ideally want to be able to have some folks who have that level of awareness, but when you bring people from the inside, the issue is they're from the inside. And so where's their allegiances ultimately lie? That's something that's really, really hard to navigate. I don't know how they're going to sort of address that issue, but I think that's kind of the reason. I mean, you're seeing this jockeying for a position right now because a variety of folks seem to feel that the writing is on the wall and that this is going to start to spill out. So everyone's trying to jockey for a position. And one of the aspects of this is potentially to cover their own, what, because of the ways in which they may or may not have been involved with this subject. And they want to be able to control how the process of truth and reconciliation happens in order to ensure that their little corner doesn't get spotlit. So I do think that is going to be a huge challenge if there ever is sort of a quote UAP czar that gets, put in place. What I will mention is an interesting aspect of this is that one of President Trump's sons, Donald Trump Jr., is very, very engaged on this idea of bringing in, a point person for UFOs into the White House. And we've sort of seen that sort of Jared and Ivanka are choosing to not be as front and center in this administration as they were in the previous one, which leaves Donald Trump Jr. a lot of freedom of movement to sort of, talk to dad about this stuff. So it's just I'm not ascribing a probability to whether or not someone will get appointed into this role.
Mhm.
You think that there's someone that there's more than one person that's going to be in the ear of the
Right.
ad around this, and so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, great stuff. And I think these are tender moments. I mean, it's the agents or the operatives or the organizations that have obfuscated this are wizards at this process of snuffing it out before it can take form and gain momentum. And so I think it's just it's a delicate moment the next maybe 30 days, 60 days. And if we get the wolf in the chicken pen, circling around and basically, containing and control disclosure possibly, I think it's a treacherous one. So a lot of interest involved. Any final thoughts, gentlemen, on the way forward, what you see as most important in this next 12 months of this new administration and heading into the unknown?
I'll just briefly mention that I think one of the reasons why you're seeing an emphasis from a lot of folks who are in and around this issue, both you know public and quote unquote behind the scenes, that this particular moment is important. And it's not important just because it's the start of another Trump administration. It is because the start of a new administration and the 119th Congress is where priorities for the next 4 years sort of get decided. Because as you start to, there's going to be inertia that builds up as the initial policy prescriptions that this admin puts in place starts to get pushback. So, for example, Trump's already introduced several executive orders and it's sort of a barrage of stuff. There's action happening. And so that creates, again, the opportunity to insert this as one of those actions that happens. We're already seeing some of these executive orders starting to get caught up in court, like the birthright citizenship issue. And as time goes on, whatever the issues are that have been established at the beginning become like the entrenched topics that just continually become the focal point of the administration. With Biden, we saw that inflation was the definitional thing at the front end, and that was the main issue that kind of transcended that whole administration. Inflation on, let's say, the border, right? So there is a window of opportunity at the beginning of a new Congress and a new admin to insert this as one of those short list of topics that will transcend and be top of mind throughout this sort of 2 and 4 year cycle. So I think that's why a lot of folks feel the need and urgency in these early days to even get a small win here or there, because you just even get one EO around this subject or the declassification of the JFK files having the UFO connection, that's just that will be a substantively different thing than we've seen before in terms of forward progress. So I think that's why people view this window of time as particularly important before the political inertia sort of kicks in.
Right.
Yeah, I think Lester is, exactly right there, but I think the window of opportunity is even more narrow because, we're not actually looking really at 4 years or even 2 years. We're looking really more like 1 year because the fact of the matter is that whatever major accomplishments that Trump is going to achieve on these matters is going to happen, in the course of 2025. Because when we get to 2026, members of Congress have to start thinking about their reelection, and they're going to be prioritizing that. And that goes for all 435 members of the House, and then about a third of the members of the Senate. And then once you get past those 2 years and get past the 2026 election, Trump is a lame duck president, and people are not going to be paying as much attention to, what he's saying, what he's doing, and what he's commanding, because people are going to be jockeying for position for, the nomination. It come 2029, or 2020 for, the next presidential cycle. So the window of opportunity is actually much more narrow, in that if we're going to accomplish something, it has to be 2025 in terms of, at least, with Trump here. And, that means him, really leaning into it in his early days here, the first few months. So, we're going to have to get some executive orders. And I think ideally, in a best case scenario, I think he issues one or more executive orders to start prying loose some of these secrets, which will prompt Congress to take it more seriously and potentially then set up their own select committee as a result of that. And I think that's really sort of the best case scenario. And maybe even Trump invite Congress to investigate and say, do an investigation, find out what it is that, my predecessors in their executive offices and departments and agencies of the executive branch have been up to for the last 80 years. Investigate it, find it out. I want to find out just as much as you do. And here's some of the breadcrumbs that I'm going to put down here for you to accomplish that mission. And then it could be bipartisan, as it has been, and potentially bicameral in the House and Senate, much like it was in the 1970s with, the Church Committee is the one that always gets the most attention, because that was on the Senate side and it's much more prestigious. But there was also, the Pike Committee on the House side. And there were essentially simultaneous investigations going on about MK Ultra and all kinds of, intelligence community and other programs going on with FBI and Department of Defense. And so we can accomplish those things, but there has to be something that sort of forces that forward into, public view. And that's why it's so important that we've had people like, Jake Barber coming forward and, really laying out there in a much more whole of pie way. David Grush laid out certain aspects of the program, crash retrieval, reverse engineering, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asked him about, the funding mechanisms for some of this stuff, how could this happen? And, various things. We sort of got into some of those components, and, Lou Elizondo certainly talked about a number of issues. But to me, the most stunning thing is, Jake Barber's recent expose with Ross Coulthart on News Nation, where, he laid out exactly sort of what has been, going on, inside of the UAP community in terms of what we're thinking is sort of happening with all these different elements of the phenomenon. And he sort of has laid it all out there, asking, inviting Congress, demanding Congress to investigate. And that's why he even said himself that he would be willing to testify in front of Congress. So that's what Congress needs to do, is they need to hold another hearing and call him to testify.
Mm. And do you guys have any word on any upcoming hearings?
I just
on the
real quick, I just want to double click on, I think Kevin's absolutely right about this, this point about the narrow window, and the way that the Republican Party in sort of the MAGA era has operated is Trump makes the mandate and then they follow that order. So if Trump were to put out the mandate to say, Congress, you need to investigate this, Johnson is going to have to about face on not doing the select committee, because that's just how this it is. That party is an audience of one in terms of who kind of is dictating the direction here. So I think that was just a really good note about if Trump creates the political cover and or the mandate around it for Congress, with having control in both chambers, they're gonna have to do something about it. And I'll just also mention that the Senate Majority Leader, we did lose a big advocate in Chuck Schumer around this with the Senate changing control. But the new Senate Majority Leader, Senator Thune, is a compatriot of Senator Mike Rounds in terms of both being from South Dakota. So that, I'm sure Rounds is already back channeling to Senator Thune around this subject. But the mandate from Trump would create the political cover for Congress to establish the committee without having to have us go to all the 435 offices in the House and 100 in the Senate in order to do so.
That'd be nice. That'd be nice to save all that energy.
Could I just one thing there, because Lester's, of course, just absolutely right there. But I would like to just throw out there that, Trump is either going to be one of two things. He's going to be a hero to transparency and disclosure of UAP, or he's going to be a villain. And one way or another, he's going to influence what Congress does. Because if he is a hero, Congress will act. If he's a villain, they will not do anything about UAP, because the Republicans do control a majority, and they are not going to investigate the executive branch if Trump tells them not to. So, this is a very precarious situation where we have a great amount of optimism, but real reason for trepidation and potentially pessimism. So we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, consequential year. I want to put this question on screen for the viewers, get them engaged. Just put it in the chat or the comment section wherever you're watching. What are the most impactful ways we can advance disclosure of UAP and NHI to the public heading into 2025? Put your comments down. I'll be sure to read those. As Lester and Kevin are highlighting, I think 2025 is a critical year. And I think there are a lot of strong players on the field, but there are some vulnerable points in the O-line or, at the passing game, what have you. I do take some comfort knowing from good sources that Trump and his inner circle have been told about certain aspects of the phenomenon, not just the superficial UAP, but also regarding some of the darker aspects of NHI involvement, which I think might compel one to get over the hurdle and pass through the pain threshold of doing this. Because once you open this up, if you open it up to the point of NHI, questions are going to come your way about abductions, about past agreements, tech transfers, other things that might have been done geopolitically that altered the state of the world that we have today during the Cold War, for example. So JFK being, obviously a potential there. So a lot of things are going to be shooting their way, and it's hard to imagine an administration wanting to put themselves on the line to deal with rapid fire when they have, like you said, Lester, so many other constituents that have been lining up for years to get their agendas through. And so it's going to be a difficult balance of risk reward, pain, pleasure. I can't see much pleasure in it, but 2025, big year, I would say. I want to turn to look at the evolving.
Say one thing real quick, Reed. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
please.
but I think that's why it's so important that Ross had the new segment with Jake Barber, was because he opened the door to a whole other set of facts that are included in the UAP discussion as it relates to crash retrieval and reverse engineering and all the other aspects that are involved. Because up until then, we talked about crash retrievals, we talked about reverse engineering, and we talked about biologics, right? But now Barber has opened up, the spectrum of this much more broadly, and he has, reportedly briefed the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and others and had conversations. So there are much more conversations going on behind the scenes than we even know about that are, potentially game changing in terms of moving this effort down the field. Now, some of that is going to rely on whether or not these people have the courage to move forward with having these hearings and investigations, because, as we've discussed earlier in your program here, there are people that feel very much threatened by continuing this work.
Right.
Can I touch on a quick semantic note here, which I think is interesting in a sort of, we were in a post-Grush era. Now we're almost in like a post-Barber era. But the term, like, terminology matters, right? And I put out a thread the other day about the term catastrophic disclosure as a concept, which we've sort of like accepted and have like integrated into our lexicon as a community, which kind of has some issues with it. But the thing I want to touch on here is with Barber's testimony about psionics teams being used to summon craft, the term crash retrieval is actually not the right, like, it might be the wrong, it's not really, because it allows folks with prior biases to immediately go to, oh, why are these things traveling tens of billions of light years just to come here and crash? And so it immediately sort of creates a mental hurdle that a lot of folks can't get over just strictly off of the terminology. And
Mhm.
based on kind of how Barbara has outlined how this works, it does kind of answer some questions around like, why aren't they just quote unquote crashing everywhere? Well, if they're being summoned into particular locations and they're using microwave pulse weapons to bring them down, it's more of like an UFO acquisition and reverse
Mhm.
engineering. I think there's something to be said about us collectively having a discussion about the terminology crash retrieval based on now the testimony that Barbara is providing about how the retrieval teams are actually operating, where it's the relationship is very different with that new testimony. So I think there's an interesting semantic discussion to happen about the terminology crash retrieval.
Great point. I think there's the terms do kind of might hinder or might veil certain aspects of what's really going on. There might be something of a hot fight going on between elements of the government and the NHI presence. And before you leap to think that that's us bad humans being, offensive, there could be a defensive element to it. There could be an attempt to gain technological parity for the purpose of maintaining, the ability to defend and to maintain the citizen government contract. There could be a lot of other layers that are not represented in these kind
Well,
of
I think,
quippy kind of ways of describing what's going on.
and one thing that should not be taken off the table is a sort of a supernatural, it's not supernatural, supranational or non-nation state hostile actor of some sort that is, involved in this to some degree. I mean, if you listen to what Barbara was saying, there's some very serious allegations there about, the private industry and their role in this. And that has to be one of the reasons why Congress needs to investigate this, because, there's potential of real danger, not just for the United States, but for other countries. And, what we're seeing happen with private industry and what their knowledge is of these craft in ways in which they may be able to communicate and also bring them in and bring them down. So this may not just be a case of U.S. national security or a case of foreign adversaries, but there could be something else going on here that that we're not aware of. It's something that's going on sub rosa.
Yeah. Oh, I actually had Carl Nell's quote on something happening sub rosa right in front of me here. I didn't pull that up. But yeah, very good point, Kevin. And this is why someone has to crack the glass and at least get us inside the box to figure out the component pieces. And so if it has to be catastrophic and done in 2025 by a president disposed to that kind of, chaotic action, I would say so be it. And we have to pick up the detritus and deal with the sequela that results. Great stuff. We'll keep talking about this. I know we've got questions, actually a lot of them lined up. I want to get into the part two, and we don't have as much time as I'd like for it, but I think it's going to be great. I want to talk about the evolution of the conversation from strictly unidentified anomalous phenomena, which used to be unidentified aerial phenomena, and then unidentified flying objects, to this wild new world called non-human intelligence. And to get us into that, I'd like to play the trailer to this upcoming documentary that is going to premiere at South by Southwest, I believe in March. It's called The Age of Disclosure. And there are some eye-opening moments in this worth further discussion. So let's roll that, and then we can talk about it.
The American people are ready to receive the truth.
Humanity is not the only intelligence in the universe.
Humanity is not the only intelligent species.
We are absolutely not alone.
Non-human intelligence exists.
UAPs are real, they're here, and they're not human. I spent 25 years as a senior official with the CIA.
I worked on highly classified UAP programs.
28 years as an astrophysicist.
I served as the 4th Director of National Intelligence.
Director of Aviation Security in the National Security Council.
A one-star admiral after 32 years of service.
People that come forward with this, I feel like they've taken their life in their own hands.
I was recruited to a highly sensitive government program that investigated unidentified aerial phenomenon.
For over 16 years, on behalf of the U.S. government, I worked as a senior intelligence official on the unidentified aerial phenomenon topic.
We learned that the U.S. government was involved in a long-running secret war with other nations. to collect and reverse engineer vehicles not made by humans.
I have seen with my own eyes non-human craft and non-human beings.
So look at that thing. It's rotating. There's a whole fleet of them.
The first country that cracks the code on this technology will be the leader for years to come.
China has established its own version of a UAP task force.
You think for a second that they wouldn't consider using it to achieve their ends of domination?
This is similar to the Manhattan Project. This is the atomic weapon on steroids.
This is so secret. Very, very few people in our entire government have been allowed access to it.
Even presidents have been operating on a need-to-know basis. That begins to ramp out of control.
It's not acceptable to have secret parts of government that no one ever sees.
You better be careful about a government that doesn't trust its people, because there's no telling what they'll pull on you.
This is the biggest discovery in human history.
You had information being locked away that could change the trajectory for species.
It has so many beneficial impacts, including clean energy.
We should have disclosure today. We should have disclosure tomorrow. The time has come.
What else you want to know?
All right. When I saw this, I said to myself, it's coming. It's coming. It's happening. Because I mean, not only the nature of the individuals present, their past credentials, but the statements being made. David Grush, 2023, biologics. Jay Stratton, 2025, bodies. We are rapidly going in the direction of physical alien biological non-human entities, which to me, it breaks us into a whole new space, a whole new conversation. It's not just the kind of, I call it the possibility parade, where we've all got our novel theories about the universe. It's angelic, it's pseudo interdimensional, it's crypto terrestrial. Not to say some of that is not possible or true, but we're talking about bodies, right? And I think this breaks us into that new space. I'd love to get your take on it.
I think it's fascinating. So what's interesting is I have a TikTok where I do like public education videos around this subject. And so it's interesting because it's separate from a lot of the active UFO community folks who might be much more attuned to the issue. And what's been interesting to see has been people, I think, overlooking the importance of the way in which the age of disclosure is set up. My view is like the audience for the age of disclosure that's most important is actually the DC blob, right? It's members, it's staffers, it's people within the executive branch, the consultants, the IC, like they all recognize a variety, like these people, they work with them, they have their own personal connection to their level of credibility, or that the fact that they know like they wouldn't be out here saying this unless they really believed it to be true. I think in terms of putting and having all of those folks in a concise, singular package with a potential theatrical release, which again has never really happened for this subject at that scale with such high production value, is again something we've never seen before. And we're not having it's not talking about the possibility parade. We're talking about the existence of non-human intelligence as a tangible thing, both the craft and the bodies. I think it is a step function change in the language and the conversation that we're having. And again, it's coming on the wake of, Barber coming forward and having his own viewpoint about talking about the crafts as being, conscious, and the potential pilots maybe actually not being conscious, but just being sort of meat robots with, like, we're having these conversations now, which is in not just in our little corner, but in a much wider, bigger tent, which to me is, again, we are moving the ball down the field if this is the conversation we are now having.
Right. Yes. What do you think, Kevin?
I totally agree with what Lester was just saying. And it goes back to part of our previous discussion, which is that, you're right. There has been an evolution of this discussion of, there was a great trepidation from earlier people in the disclosure movement, and even like Lou Elizondo at the beginning of, him coming forward, didn't want to touch the subject of, abductions and those sorts of things, right? But now these things are becoming much more openly discussed, and I have to laugh with the idea of the meat robots, because it's sort of a strange way of talking about it. But there's been great discussion and some evidence and things from people who may be in the know that have talked about particularly like certain species that are alleged to exist that aren't really actually living beings, that they are part biological, part machine. They are for whatever reason why they would be that way. I have no idea. But the fact that we are talking about this in public now, and not just in our own Slack chats or on WhatsApp with other proponents of UAP advocacy, but actually having these discussions on News Nation, is actually kind of mind-blowing that we're at this stage now. So that alone shows us that there is great promise for this to move forward here, and have even deeper, more meaningful discussions about this, and also expand that conversation beyond just sort of the the social media component of UAP advocacy in the discussion, and bring it into not just the living rooms of your neighbors' houses in grassroots organizing, but in town halls and in your churches and schools and things. Because those are sort of the next steps as this progresses, if we're successful, because those conversations are going to have to be had.
Right. Yep. Lester, I thought today of the what is this called? The life cycle curve. Let's put this on screen here. This is a tweet from you, and the whole thing of the vanguard or the forefront and the caboose. Do you see things like this tugging that caboose forward?
So this is so funny you're pulling this up. Yeah, no. So I think what's interesting is in the tech space we have this idea of this adoption curve model, which you basically have these like sort of 5 buckets, right? And the real kind of insight on this was this thing called the chasm. So it's the it's in this visual, it's the difference between the visionaries, which are like a part of the early adopter group, right? We're talking about 15%, versus the early majority, right? Which is this sort of green bucket of 34%, the pragmatists. And to the left, it's like people who need like minimum viable, like information in order to be like interested. And then to the right, it's like people who like need the complete information to be able to like engage in the issue. And this is kind of the place we've been at for so long, which is, and I'm seeing this again in folks who are commenting on sort of public education videos I put out. They're like, yes, we know about that there's this alleged program. Yes, we like have heard it from people of different levels of rank and all this stuff. But like where's the beef, right? And that's kind of this chasm that we're trying to cross right now to get to that early majority, this what I call like the buffer zone. So a lot of times, like, Reed, you kind of are at what I call like the bleeding edge or the forefront of the conversation. But there's also the caboose. This is like where everyone else is. And we don't want the delta between the bleeding edge conversation and where everyone else is in the caboose to get wider and wider, because it becomes harder to then bridge that gap. So a lot of the work that I try to do is bringing the folks who don't know really much closer and closer to the types of conversations that you have, Reed, about getting past, like, what are we disclosing? What are the implications? What does free will mean in a world where we're not the highest in the pecking? There's a whole slew of stuff to talk about, which we're now the caboose is getting closer to starting to have some of those deeper, more meaningful conversations, despite sort of the where's the beef issue.
Right.
Yeah. And I just want to quickly couch this by saying, I experiencers have a direct relationship with the phenomenon, and so they don't need to prove the case, right? They're at a place where they're talking about what does it mean for me, for my family, for my whole worldview, all this. I want to be careful in sort of identifying that, like, yes, like that, those experiences are legitimate, and there's like, I'm not trying to say that they don't exist. I think the thing is, there's a majority of people that don't have that personal experience and don't have the information, and that's a cohort we need to bring into the conversation, which is not negating the experience of experiences. It's just a fact of the reality.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Having this conversation with the broad public is like top of the order of what I feel like I need to be doing and others need to be doing. And as I have the conversation, people are surprisingly able to go to the point of the potential that there's alien life in the universe. You know, science discovering exoplanets, discovering how voracious life is at arising in hostile environments. Could we be discovered? Could we be visited? Could that be what's behind the UFO phenomenon? People are very able to go there. And I see the possibility parade, which I understand we have to entertain possibilities before we can move on to focus on probabilities. But the public doesn't necessarily need to get on that parade. And as I see indications and evidence begin to mount up of physical, biological, alien visitors, I see the public both ready to engage with that, but I do see some sort of internal impedance in at least the UFO community to begin to focus in on that as a probability. And I just want to acknowledge that. I don't know if that's a self-reinforced, kind of, it's like part of the code of the community to not conclude. We don't conclude around here. We just entertain possibilities. And the moment someone comes by saying, "I think this is probably what it is," it's like they're singled out and ostracized. I do feel that sometimes. I want to point out in this documentary two things that are just worth cause for pause. Um, I saw this tweet by Marek von Rennenkampf, which was a good question. What is the former director of national intelligence, James Clapper, doing in a film titled The Age of Disclosure, alongside all these people who are actually a part of the Age of Disclosure? To which I wryly put, straight from the age of cover up, grand smack in the middle of the age of disclosure. But this again is, I would imagine the old guard and the old legacy program people, due to whatever factors, whether it's a sense of duty to nation and God and country, or out of protecting their own selves due to liability, or out of national security, some hawkish belief about that, they might try to get in on this conversation and shape it further. And I think I sense that in this teaser trailer, you know, um, a few things, if I may call out. I think this was Jay Stratton who said, a long running secret war with other nations to collect non human craft. Wow. Okay. We got a problem, planet Earth. But then it rapidly goes from basically these entities, non human intelligence is real, to who's the first country that's going to get this tech? Don't think China won't use it against us. This is an atomic weapon on steroids. And so there is this kind of nationalistic security framing. And then it expands into clean energy, the possibilities. And I find that there's a cognitive dissonance there. It's like, wait a minute, there is a secret arms race under the skin of world affairs. And we're talking about free energy that will be equitably distributed and scaled up according to what the climate crisis and staying under 1.5 C of temperature. I mean, come on now. Like, we are crossing wires in terms of, logical thinking here. Did you guys pick up on any flavors like that in this?
Well, I would say look, I think there's probably a lot of different, as we touched on earlier, a lot of different interests in terms of disclosure and transparency, advocacy, and those interests often lie in, financial rewards and things. But I think that when it comes to trying to sell the general populace on disclosure and transparency, you have to appeal to a wide audience. And when you're trying to appeal to a wide audience, some of those people are very much concerned about just national security. Some of those are interested in energy. Some of them are interested in climate and climate change. Some of them are interested in, any number of issues. So if you're going to mass, market a film about NHI and craft created by NHI, then you have to find a way that's going to appeal to the widest audience possible. So I think that's why you see, national security implications, as well as, clean energy. But I'll also say that, Reed, that I think that there was no promise of distribution of clean energy to the masses to solve climate change, because obviously, if we're going to sell clean energy, somebody's going to make money on it.
Right.
And somebody's going to pay for it.
Right. And I don't see folks go that far down the thought process. We're just like, okay, let's imagine for a moment that this technology could actually replace fossil fuels at a fundamental level, science level.
Right.
How do you deploy that across society? How do you distribute the wealth that would be generated from that equitably? I mean, even the AI community is talking about universal salaries because they realize AI is just going to wipe out vast portions of the working population, their jobs. So, I think we need to begin thinking about that. And, yeah.
I think this is, I mean, these are the conversations I love to have, which is like operationalizing, like what are the operational things that actually have to happen for this to move forward? So, the energy angle is one of these third rails, right? Abductions is a third rail, retrievals is a third rail, energy is a third rail. The US has been able to gain power globally through sort of the petrodollar system. And there are a lot of people, you can sort of point to someone like Vice President Dick Cheney, who were heavily invested in the continued sort of dominance of oil and gas as a sort of foreign policy priority. Russia uses, oil as a means of control over the EU. I mean, it's a tool that is used in this battle for sort of geopolitical dominance. And so the actual process of taking this and then scaling it up to a global system is an enormous challenge. And I think part of the question there is, and I got this comment yesterday, which is kind of the first time I got this. Someone watched the trailer and then said, I work in oil and gas. And when Mellon said the thing about clean energy, that made me really worried for me and my community and my friends and family, because I don't know what we're going to do. Right. Like that's a real implication of, kind of rolling stuff out. And part of, there's a whole variety of things to do, but this is part of why we put out a white paper at UAP Caucus about the idea of the US creating a sovereign wealth fund around this issue as a means by which to handle IP rights, right? In sort of a centralized authority that is collectively owned by all of us. You could still have a national security apparatus and open the kimono to more defense-related entities and universities to access the underlying technology to work on it. And then the fruits of all of the derivative technology, some portion of that rolls up to all of the people that are working on it. But we all get to share in the pot. Like you have to have some kind of model that is akin to a sovereign wealth fund in order to sort of deal with this, because the implications theoretically of the impact of the underlying and derivative technologies is in the order of trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, and is a total reshaping of several key industries, finance and energy just being two of many. And so, I mean, I could talk about this until I'm blue in the face, but
Please do. This is so critical. If anything, if 2025, if things are going to move rapidly, if they have to move rapidly, we'll see. I don't know if they will, but this is what has to come rapidly, right on the heel of any admission of a non-human intelligent actor with technologies either being crashed, recovered, or deposited, or transacted, or downed by actual non-state actors. I mean, we're breaking into new spaces. It's like paper thin walls, and you're just crashing right through into a space you never thought you'd be in. And I think we're here. I mean, we were all at the Seoul conference, and I heard. I'll just read these off. I mean, these were eye-popping questions, statements that I heard that I think need to become part of the conversation. Somebody said on stage UAP as structured vehicles. Okay, that was good. That can we move beyond phenomena, to talk about what these probably really are? Gary Nolan, can you be accused of murdering an alien under human law? Question mark. Can you patent something invented by an alien? Question mark. Now it goes in reverse. Can an alien be prosecuted under human law for murdering a human or for abducting a human, right? It cuts both ways. What is the application of legal frameworks upon non-human entities? Like we have human rights, right? They're inherent. We hold them as inherent to ourselves. So if another sentience conducts an operation against an individual non-consensually, doesn't law apply to protect the inherent rights of that individual? So I mean, if I may continue, there's a few others. Leslie Kane, in a duo with Peter Skafish, are NHI in control of things directly? She asked this question. And Peter Skafish replied, I don't think we have enough facts in the public to responsibly ask the question above. I just jotted this down in the moment. That was part of the opening of the conference, but later on, Carl Nell in the Hilbert problems that he presented, number 23, I mean, I sketched this one down real fast. Have NHI been conducting public diplomacy or possibly covert societal manipulation via interaction with close observers? I felt this pressure at that conference, at least, to press into these new spaces, have these new conversations. So happy to get into that deeper. And Lester, please feel free to keep going because this is what we're here for.
I mean, I think this is it becomes challenging. This is why sort of Jake Barber and the rest of the tier one operators around him coming forward, bringing the consciousness connection into like the operational context, right? So like, how do we operationalize the consciousness connection has been, again, a little bit of a door opener to start to be like, oh, okay, so we have private contractors, we have the government. There seems to be conflict between those two entities around this, which is a whole can of worms in and of itself. And there are, I mean, if it's the whole issue of like the famous slide 9 that leaked from Chris Mellon's website years ago, which sort of outlined that like this phenomena has the ability to control and manipulate, physical and consciousness and all of these aspects. So what is to say that we, like human sovereignty as a species, like maybe we don't have that? And what does that mean if we don't actually have that level of sort of individual will that we sort of perceive to be true? And it's also the idea of like, this is why it's challenging because, okay, if the government comes forward and tells us, oh, there's this entity that, particularly with the abductions issue, that can come and kidnap you in the middle of the night and we can't do anything about it, then what are we paying taxes for? You know what I mean? Like that becomes, an inherent implication of like, oh, well, if you can't protect me and we're giving you guys $800 billion a year, what are you spending that money? It is a very dicey, it gets very dicey very quickly. I think, it's easy to kind of look at this issue and feel like, oh, this is fun and cool and be curious and like, oh, we're living in the most important time in human history. But it's the after disclosure questions that are actually the most important, because society has to operate in some capacity with 3, 4, 5, 6 billion people having some level of consensus reality, which is already hard to do in the information age, around the fact that there is a hierarchy of being where we are, whatever book you read defines like there being a creator, and then there's maybe some things in between, but one of those things in between might be manifesting in a very personal and physical way that a lot of times when we look through the religious lens is more allegory and more about sort of not, people don't think about it as a tangible, like real life. When I take my kids to the park, like this is something that's engaging with me right now in that context, which is scary for a lot of people.
Right. I mean, Jake Barber talked about feeling like the entity was inside him, or that it had entered his psyche, and there was an immense feeling, positive feeling, which, that's good. I mean, positive feelings can be generated neurologically, biochemically. So just because you feel good doesn't mean it is good. But maybe somebody else down the street doesn't want to have a non-human entity enter their consciousness and essentially take over, control their neurology. I mean, so you're right. Like what this does to me is it turns my mind to all of the vulnerabilities and entry points into our human world that are risk vectors. AI, for example, we've already leaked our species data set into space. I'm sure we've been broadcasting it for 80 years. And so who's to say they can't basically take that and run their own artificial intelligence upon our species or begin to shape us technologically by depositing craft or technologies or influencing us in a truly consciousness level psi way. And so these are all potential entry points that we have no ability to plug. And so is this part of the reason for non-disclosure? I go back to, I have it right here. I look at it somewhat often, Carl Nell's from Carnell's presentation at the 2023 Seoul conference. I'll stick this up here. But there are real reasons for non-disclosure. I'm in no defense of them, but you can read these on your own time. I recommend you pull up this image. But if I may zoom in, NHI quid pro quo, right? This for that. That means transaction. That means things have been given and things have been gotten. I mean, it doesn't mean that. These are potentials. He's raising as possibilities here. NHI intentions remain unknown, as they certainly do. And so, if we have a covert operator in our world, conducting themselves in this way, it's cause for concern, and it kind of puts us back on ourselves. The phrase human sovereignty is a major focus of mine. I think this, no matter what the intent of the entity or whatever entities, plural, they might be plural, we have some work to do to build a framework to articulate a sovereign human reality in what might be an ecosystem of life, and who can transit borders, who can enter airspace, sea space, who can interact with civilians. So we have no policies drafted, no treaty level agreements made for any of this stuff, and flat-footed would be to say the least. So I think this opens up a whole new world of conversations and important work to do.
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Please, Kevin. Yeah.
I was going to say, this gets into a serious layer of complexity, and we're talking more about intent here. And so, like the slide that you just showed from Carnell's 2023 Seoul Symposium presentation, some of the things against disclosure would be not knowing what the intent is, and then also the potential of a quid pro quo. I think it's also possible that there could be a combination of the things, but an unknown quid pro quo. And what I mean by that is that there's been, a lot of discussions, and a lot of people have written about and theorized that, that the crashes, or even the objects that come in that are called in allegedly, as talked about by Jake Barber, that come in, and he even said that they leave you a gift. And some of the crashes might be gifts. And so what is the reason for those gifts? And those gifts would be technology or pathways to technology, physics, mathematical equations, and these sorts of things. And so what would be the purpose of that? And so if you can't decipher that, then you don't know what the intent of that is. And there could also be a quid pro quo in the sense that you're giving something and you're openly receiving it, but not knowing exactly what you're giving in return, which also plays into the intent. So that we don't know what the intent is, and we don't know if they're seeding technology and physics and math to us for our own benefit or to our own detriment. So that's something that I think that has to have serious discussion as we move forward here.
Right. Yeah.
I think another aspect to this, and I was having a conversation with Dr. Beatrice Villarreal, who kind of was pontificating. Like, if you were to take the von Neumann or von Neumann probe concept, the idea that an extraterrestrial species creates these AI probes that traverse all over the universe, monitor planets for the rise of other intelligent life. If you take that as an entry point, right? One of the things she brought up is like, how do you integrate the physicality of the craft with the consciousness connection that is clearly sort of part of this issue? And like her kind of like thought experiment was, imagine that these von Neumann probes, which are able to self-replicate on any planet they go to, are able to interface with individual conscious beings, but also similar to how Teslas have fleet learning, where when one Tesla gets in a crash, immediately the rest of the fleet has that information. Imagine that you now have several of these that are interfacing with close observers on a regular basis. And it's sort of like the valet control system concept, where if you have basically self-replicating probes that have the ability to interface with your consciousness, which means it can project, this is maybe the reason why some people see one thing versus another when they both have a sighting at the same time. If things can be projected into our consciousness, and that's kind of like the way in which this thing is working. I mean, that capability in the hands of other human beings creates a whole new consciousness. Like, what if now we're having this issue where, like, what is the legal framework around humans using this methodology against other humans? We're now having like mind, thought, crime kind of
Right.
stuff, which gets a
Philip
little
K. Dick Minority Report, man.
right,
I
and
know.
that becomes, you know. And then the question is, like, do we ever really have the ability to understand the intent if they're able to interface in that kind of capacity? And is intent ultimately unknowable? And if intent is ultimately unknowable, you know, how do we navigate? I mean, these are like really deep and disturbing
Huge questions.
questions. But that's kind of, I think, you know, that was an interesting entry point for me, just like to be grounded somewhere and then like using these concepts. Oh yeah, like you could imagine that we have, you know, our stuff, every rovers and stuff like that. And then if you just put the Neuralink concept but make it wireless, right? You know, that becomes the through line to where we are to like that being a thing. If this species or intelligence of is 100,000, 500,000, a million, a billion years older than us, you know, it's not inconceivable.
Yeah, I think, you know, if I may just jump in here, I think, you know, these when we break into these new spaces, we go to the extreme. We imagine that, okay, oh my God, are they enacting complete neurological control over the whole population? Are they able to intercept thoughts, plant thoughts, impede cognition broadly to such that even if you think you know their intent, that was their intent that you knew their intent to be that. You know, we go to those extremes. I happen to have a lot of personal experience on this side of the phenomenon, and you know, I would just argue that it's not that extreme or that extensive. It's more selective. And there are ways to obstruct that level of influence, logical thought, executive function being one of them. And so I think there's a middle line to walk here. I just wanted to put this on screen here. I was on my mind the other day. This is Matt Pines sharing something he was told by a senior DoD intel person. AI, quantum, and the Grush stuff are three sides of one triangle. Now that could be its own episode right there. But you know, we're breaking into this new space. I would say we're dealing with a non-mechanistic phenomenon in the form of a sentience that is more intelligent than our own. So we can try to study it and analyze it and research it in the skies and the waters all we want. It sees us, it perceives us, it responds to us. Now, I would say, and I people tell me a lot, you can't even presume to be able to know their intent. It's if they are a million years beyond us, which is itself an assumption, you know, even the belief that the intent would fall into a spectrum of human interpretive models, whether it's hostile, beneficial, is moot, right? And of course, it's possibly true. Like the intent could be vastly undecipherable or undefinable. But I still would say that we need to enact the attempt to understand the intent as it relates to human interests and human values, and not to such that we're going to climb inside them and know them, their civilization, what have you, but we can look at their observable behavior and the trends and the patterns of that behavior to decode what that means for human interests. So it's reconnaissance of intent for the purpose of collective human response, because in the end we do have to respond, right? We can't just study this for another 100 years, I would argue.
No, I think that's a really, really, really good way to kind of couch it. We're still here, regardless of that. And so we're still in an environment where we need to operate. And so there are a variety of ways in which that knowledge or that journey of understanding or trying to gain better understanding creates new modalities by which we can relate to each other and this larger ecosystem around us. Particularly, right, if the intersection of what we hear in the telepathy tapes and then sort of this idea of, you know, how Jake Barber has brought forth the mechanics by which retrievals are operating, this sort of collective consciousness as a thing, or moving from a matter, like consciousness arises out of matter worldview to you know, matter arises out of consciousness. there's just it kind of hurts my brain a little bit. I tend to sort of stay. This is why I stay in the policy lane, because it's so you can sort of get really deep. But I do think that Matthew Pine's tweet I found fascinating, because Lewis sort of also made the sort of note that what was once sea monsters was just big blue whales, and what was once whatever is just quantum mechanics, right? Or something to that effect. And so there is I think a lot of space for discovery, despite the ultimate ability to decipher intent one way or another.
Right. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is about what we humans have to do in our space. It kind of comes down to us more than, quote, them, even though they are opening up our aperture to experience what is and has always been there, potentially, that might look paranormal or, alien. It actually might just be elements of our ecosystem or exosystem that are staring us in the face. I think there is some cause here. When you take all of it together, all facets of the phenomenon, all of the indications, whether it's from, the direct physical contact, individual contact, to the government, deep secret arms race over technologies, there is a policy potential recommendation or proposal that we need a firm remove and reset. We need NHI, whatever they are, whatever their intent, as unknowable as it is, to remove themselves from our physical human space and our psychological human space for a period of time, such that we can formulate our human intent, our rules of engagement, and whatever policies that we need to enact to create a sovereign scenario for the human species, that we retain our species' organic developmental trajectory, our technological developmental trajectory, not knowing, because those could be influenced in any one of a number of ways. And so I think there's an inherent crux of this that you get when you break down to the bottom brick of this wall. There could be multiple forms of life and interacting with us at the same time, of multiple intents, of competing intents. And how are we ever going to suss through that and not pick sides, pick NHIs, separate, divide over technology or alliances or what have you? A remove and a reset could be a policy recommendation to consider. And I say it on this show because you guys are in that space, involved in these kinds of thoughts.
It's funny. It makes me think of you're sort of calling for an NHI détente, an easing of sort of this engagement in order for us to. That's an interesting. That's an interesting. The word détente just came to mind just from like the policy space, but that is a because
And,
we collectively decide what to do in a space where we can feel like we're doing so on our own volition.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great point of discussion, but at the same time, we have to get through sort of the first couple steps here of the disclosure and things before we can really wrap our minds around, having that data of, self-reflection and trying to decide how we're going to move forward, because people have to, on mass scale, understand that this is actually going on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I mean, we do have to establish existence. That was in Carl Nell's sequence of phases of disclosure. Like, you have to demonstrate existence before you can move on to talk about dealing with their existence. I think you're right there. I'd like to move on
before we're going to have a vote on a bill or something like that. There's a debate about the contents of that bill, right? So before we can have a discussion about what we want to do as a species in relationship to potentially other species or another species or something, we have to know what's going on that first. So that's the first order of business.
I think some spatial distance is going to be important there, because Carl Nell, NHI has been interacting with humanity. Oh, has it? How have they been interacting? With who? Who chose to initiate? Who chose to continue? So there's so many lines and vectors of unknown nature there. I think some spatial distance is going to be important so that we can potentially initiate the agreement instead of grandfather it in. And I think for the present administration, do they want to be the one that facilitates humanity making a deal with NHI versus grandfathering in the deal that was made? And so I think there's an opportunity there But I think initially it has to be a diplomatic arrangement whereby you sit across the table. But if the person across the table is already in your own mind or deep inside your society, or is already engineering things with your opponents to provoke physical kinetic conflicts that, distort your society, that's a major problem.
I do think I think this is one of those things where we kind of have to walk and chew gum, and this is where I talk about the bleeding edge conversation and the caboose, because you could look at other things like wargaming, right? Like there are all aspects of both governmental and private and corporate entities that game out hypothetical scenarios in order to deal with risk management or optimizing for certain outcomes. And so it's difficult because we're operating sort of with limited information, so it becomes hard to war game with limited information. So the where's the beef is still such a key part of this, because unless we can make this less abstract for billions of people, it's just going to continue to kind of be this level of sort of apathetic curiosity that has existed, where there is a group of people who have, for whatever reason, attuned to this issue despite being able to see the beef. And then that, going back to that adoption curve, not ever being able to cross the chasm to capture the minds of the early majority, that is such a key facet to being able to then expand the amount of information, which then expands our ability to sort of do that kind of wargaming process. So this is why I always say there's so much work to do.
Yeah. You posted on X that photo of Michael Jordan, outwork everyone. It's the only way. I resonate with that, honestly. It's going to take some serious output to get down the line.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you both have time for a few questions? I know we're over time a little bit here.
I'm okay.
Yeah, a couple of minutes.
Okay, great. All right. Let's turn to a few questions. There's actually quite a few. What are the guests' thoughts on the need for the Trump administration needing to have bilateral UAP agreements with the following nations: Canada, UK, Australia, Italy, Japan, Brazil, South Korea, and the Vatican?
I think to the extent that we can not make this an American issue and we can make it a global humanity issue is a net positive. Knowing the history of the Trump administration in doing anything bilateral, they don't have a good history of these bi or multilateral, like viewing that as a good policy approach. So I think the viability of that coming out of this administration is maybe not actually that feasible, but in theory, like, yes, like it should be a global conversation. And I think we do need to lead, but bring everyone along with us to the extent that we can.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we're talking about the Trump administration and they play by different rules, but every administration does too, and some take into account the thoughts and opinions and interests of other foreign nations and allies. And I think that when it comes to the Trump administration needing to have bilateral UAP agreements with some of our, let's say, Five Eyes countries, I don't think that he's probably going to take a lot of care or interest in that. I mean, if you look at the historical sort of record of, the UAP secrecy, a lot of it has been hidden from them. I mean, some of it has been in coordination, and certain governments know certain things, but they certainly don't know everything. And if you look back at like the 1971 Australian assessment of the United States and UFOs, like they came to their own conclusions about what we knew and what we were researching in terms of anti-gravitic technologies, and clearly they were not sort of read in on things. So when it comes to consulting South Korea or Japan prior to make a decision to disclose certain things about UAP, I don't think that's probably going to happen.
What about NATO? What about the United Nations as viable platforms to make a declaration or to, gather together?
I would certainly say that, the United Nations is irrelevant to Trump and his administration. NATO, he obviously has some things going on with NATO about making them pay their fair share. And, there is some hand wringing out there about whether or not, he would leave NATO or, come to a NATO country's defense and various things like that. So, I still think that, Trump will play by his own rules and make his own decisions. Will they give some countries a heads up or something? I have no idea. You have to look at sort of the record of what Trump has said and done, and his intentions and his regard for sort of norms that we come to expect when it comes to our allies, our adversaries, our alliances, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just briefly add that we also have to keep in mind that, and I think MP Larry Maguire kind of made this argument to the Canadian government, which is we need to position ourselves independent of the US around this issue globally, because the US is clearly not playing ball with us right now. And so who knows what the hell they're going to do. And obviously with Trump in there and the way that he conducts foreign policy, a lot of the sort of classic Western alliances are trying to figure out ways to maintain their own independence and not have as much of an over-reliance on the US in a conventional sense. So I think you're already seeing, with Larry Maguire being the sort of the only tentpole version of this, other Western folks within governments, small amount, trying to make the argument that, Larry Maguire's argument is like Canada should lead on this, and we shouldn't show deference to the US for any reason because they've not read us in, so why should we? And so there is a tension there, right? Where it's like, I think there's also a question of is one of the great powers, US, Russia, China, you could argue, you put in, the nexus of North Korea, Iran, or Israel, is it actually a good thing for it to come from one of us, which will naturally aggravate the already inflamed tensions globally in a variety of theaters? Or what happens if it's like one of the Scandinavian nations, a Switzerland type, which has sort of less baggage in that context, that wouldn't necessarily be kindling for an immediate kinetic response to. So the point is the geopolitics of this is also extremely complicated, which we didn't even touch on really across the conversation.
Yeah, truly. And I mean, Trump is a divisive personality, and trust is a big factor in whether disclosure is seen to be disclosure. So if someone who is not trusted tries to disclose, and that's looked like it's seen to be a psyop or a national security play, or that's a problem internationally. And this is where I did want to get into the international side, because I'm kind of passionate about it, getting this out of the US, out of the military industrial complex into global society. Could the Vatican potentially initiate, or a consortium of religious organizations? I mean, there are other pathways. I can't say they have, a ton of juice to them, in terms of, will it work? Will it happen? But, could a declaration be made at the United Nations? And could Trump imagine that as be the greatest American president, in history, because you're the one that brought the world together around this issue, versus you brought America together around this issue and divided the world. And not to say that he would do that and others wouldn't. Maybe Biden could have divided the world as well. I mean, it's that kind of issue.
I think, unfortunately, the America First presidency and the isolationist nature of Trump's sort of general policy approaches, I think just practically speaking, probably make that not feasible, which I think is why like a lot of folks in and around this that are trying to like move. This is why the focus is on executive orders and just like, the things that sort of speak to Trump's personality. Just given again that he just has shown no interest in international relations and in the conventional sense that we've seen over the last several decades for American presidents.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I know it's getting late. I want to ask you both: what's your bottom line? What's your point of passion? What's the order of the day, or the order for marching forward? What do you guys? What's up for you?
I would go ahead, Kevin.
No, I mean, I work with several organizations, but one of them is New Paradigm Institute. So, one of the things that we're focusing on is the Citizens for Disclosure movement, which is trying to organize people on the ground in all 50 states, get them to be leaders in their states, educate the public, and then mobilize them, in a political sense to compel their elected officials to get to the bottom of this issue, and turn this, UAP into a viable political movement, coming into the next election, which will be 2026. So that gives us 2 years to do. And then we obviously do lots of different calls to action, asking the public to email their members of Congress, and one recently to email President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance and even First Lady Melania Trump. So there's a lot of different things that we can do to, progress this forward. And I know that, Lester's UAP caucus is doing good work, and the other organization he's working on, UAP Disclosure Fund, doing various similar things, but we all need to sort of work together on, convincing Congress to pass enhanced whistleblower protection legislation, to form a select committee, and then see what happens from there. But eventually there'll need to be, truth and reconciliation and various things. So even if disclosure or affirmation started happening, tomorrow morning with an executive order from Donald Trump, this was still going to be a multi-year process.
Mm-hmm. Great, Kevin. I have on screen here, NPI has a number of ways that you can reach out to your representative on very constructive lines of action. So thank you for them and you for organizing this. And then over to you, Lester.
Yeah, there's so many places to start. What I would do is I would encourage everyone to talk to the people around you that are closest to you. Part of the challenge of the information age we live in is that folks there's just a lack of trust in information streams. So the best and easiest place to break through is, with people who know you. And so one of the number one things people can do is socialize this issue amongst your family and friends, because you're the most likely to break through their prior biases. And that's one of the greatest ways we can increase the number of people in the tent that are then taking the action of advocating for folks to do something about it. So I would say that's like a keynote. Engaging members of Congress and the executive branch on this is key. I think because of the dynamics we talked about in this discussion, things are likely to flow down from the mandate from the White House. So creating an environment where there's a perceived political incentive to move on this issue, which is by showing that the public is demanding the answers to this, is going to be really important. I agree with everything Kevin said about select committee, whistleblower protections. All of that is true. I will just make this last note that I made this kind of analogy where it was information is sort of like 9/10 of the law with this, and the information lies within the executive branch. So the challenge becomes the Congress has capabilities to deal with this, but they need to show courage, which the methodology for which is the select committee. If we start to get some of the doors to get unlocked within the executive branch by way of some forms of executive action, the ability to then access the information by unlocking those doors, even if it's not a major aspect of the way that Trump operates in this administration, is going to allow us to then build that political will within Congress to then start to really take the issue seriously. So engage with the people around you. It's so important. If you're someone who's listening to this conversation, you're clearly in tune, and that's one of the number one things you can do, because folks are not going to believe the government, or they're not going to believe the news for any number of social dynamic reasons about fake news and psyops and all this other stuff. We have to talk with the people around us and build that coalition, individual by individual, that will then create the wave of people that are now demanding the answers. Just in terms of the work that we do, continue to support all advocacy organizations that are in the space. There's New Paradigm Institute, the Declassified UAP Caucus. So there's any number of ways to reach out, get your representatives' information, and just beat the drum on this, right? Because part of the reason why, as Kevin said earlier, when you go to Congress, people are not in tune to this is because they don't believe that their constituents want information on this. And we know from polling that people want, and you can just look at the numbers on social media when anytime there's an article about this, there's huge demand and interest, but there's almost this belief by people that me saying something about it to my representative is not going to do anything. These are political animals. They will go with wherever the wind blows. So we need to start generating our own wind. And then I would just mention that with UAPDF, UAP Disclosure Fund, we're really trying to push introducing and integrating the discovery and science conversation with the policy conversation, because they are symbiotic in the sense that as the stigma decreases, we can push more scientific funding, which can get us data that does not require us waiting. As more data and the reality and the where's the beef conversation gets more materialized, that necessarily forces the hand of the government, who is going to have to take a position on this issue one way or another. So talk to people you know, talk to people around you. It's so valuable.
Thank you, Lester. Really appreciate that.
And that's why, I mean, Lester and I have worked together. Our various organizations have worked together. And that's what, everyone in this community needs to do is, set aside some of their own preconceived notions, some of their own interests, and realize that the coalition building that goes on here with Lester, myself, with other organizations is what's going to help move this forward and get us across the finish line, because, members of Congress need those coalitions too, to understand that their constituents care. So it's valuable that all of us work together on this.
Yeah. Great, gentlemen. So thank you so much for being here and being a part of that coalition. And, so important that we march more increasingly all as one in this direction. So really appreciate your contributions and everything you do. So be well, and I will be in touch.
Thank you, Reed.
Thanks, Reed. Yep. Thank you. Great to have you guys. And I have on screen here UAP Caucus's website. Do recommend taking a look at what they've got. They actually have a lot of resources. They have a taxonomy of NHI being an origin. They have different guides to help, suss through the different aspects of the phenomenon and introduce it to people you're in touch with. So definitely check that out. And I will say, just in closing, this topic of citizen disclosure, as Kevin discussed with NPI's work, UAP Caucus, UAP Disclosure Fund, I think it's critical, not only to cause disclosure, but to corroborate and verify the claims made by authorities. This thing of a false authority syndrome where, the authority says that this is what's happening and people just follow. Well, we need to verify that in the citizen space. And I think, at the citizen level is where a lot of the potential interactions have occurred with non-human intelligence that has been interacting with humanity. We are the human beings. We are humanity, you and me, the individuals. And so there is a layer of citizen disclosure that needs to ride on top of whatever government or religious political institutions, the actions that they take. So very passionate about that. Definitely encourage you to have the UFO conversation, like Lester just said. I do it all the time. And as I do it, I experience myself essentially disclosing the phenomenon to people. And they have an aha moment, probably one they'll never forget. And if you do it in the right way and respect their evidentiary requirements and their tolerance level, you can actually build for them a sense of authenticity and reality to the phenomenon that they actually respond to in their own way. And then they go initiate their own research or whatever their journey is with the phenomenon. So citizen disclosure and the UFO conversation, please have it. In closing, I just want to highlight a few links related to these two gentlemen who joined me today. You can track down Lester at his website here, lesternare.com, and on X. And those are the two organizations that Lester's connected to. And then for Kevin, he's on X and LinkedIn, and there's his website at the bottom. This has been a great conversation, everyone. I couldn't pick a better topic, better time, better moment, given all factors. So very happy to have had this with you all. Next show, it's going to be yours truly, myself, solo, sitting here in the studio talking to you about my perspective on what 2025 needs to hold for us as we advocate for the issue of UAP transparency, but also as we support the public's increased awareness of a non-human intelligence in our world and what humanity collectively can begin to do about that. So I have a lot to share with you. I've been holding it back over many episodes, and now I get to just present it to you all. So look forward to that 2 weeks from now, 9 o'clock Eastern. And with that, I'll say good night, take care, and welcome to the front lines as we proceed. Thank you all.